The Woman Who Was Never Missed, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with a woman whose disappearance goes unnoticed by everyone, except Miss Marple. As she quietly follows the smallest clues, she begins to uncover a truth someone believed would remain forgotten forever. Before we uncover the mystery of the woman who was never missed, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1. The Woman Who Was Never Missed. The village of Ashcombe prided itself on knowing everyone's business. Curtains twitched before breakfast, gates creaked open just enough for a curious glance. By the time the church bell rang, half the village already knew who had received a letter, who had visitors, and who had forgotten to trim the hedge. It was the sort of place where even a missing cat became the chief topic over tea. Miss Marple arrived on a cool autumn morning to spend a few days with her old friend Mrs. Eliza Barton. Nothing unusual seemed to be happening. The market square bustled with familiar faces. The baker laughed with his customers. Children chased one another around the old stone fountain. It all looked perfectly ordinary, almost too ordinary. Later that afternoon, while enjoying tea in the village café, Miss Marple noticed an elderly gentleman studying the empty chair beside the window. He shook his head with a puzzled smile and said, almost to himself, "Funny thing, I used to see Mrs. Edith Hargreaves sitting there every Thursday. Haven't seen her for months." The waitress looked up only briefly. "Oh, yes. I'd forgotten all about her." "So had I," another customer added with a shrug. "Quiet woman, kept herself to herself." The conversation drifted away as quickly as it had begun. Someone complained about the weather. Another spoke about the church roof. Within moments, the name Edith Hargreaves had vanished from the room as though it had never been spoken. Miss Marple wrapped both hands around her teacup. That, more than anything, troubled her. Villagers rarely forgot people. They remembered old quarrels for decades. They remembered birthdays, illnesses, and family stories stretching back generations. Yet here was a woman who had disappeared without leaving so much as a ripple. That evening, Miss Marple took the long path past Ivy Lane, where Mrs. Hargreaves lived in a small stone cottage covered in climbing roses. The garden had been neglected. Fallen leaves covered the path. The roses had long since faded. Yet the front doorstep was clean, freshly swept. Someone had cared enough to keep it tidy. She stood quietly at the gate for several moments. No lights glowed behind the curtains. No sound came from inside. Even the air felt oddly still. A neighbour noticed her lingering and wandered over with a basket of vegetables. "Looking for Edith?" he asked. "I was wondering where she'd gone." He frowned. "Couldn't tell you. Strange, really. I don't suppose I've seen her since, well—" His voice faded. He looked genuinely confused. "I can't even remember." Miss Marple gave a gentle smile, though her thoughts were already racing. Memory was a curious thing. One person might forget a date, another might forget a face, but an entire village did not simply forget a neighbour. As the evening light slipped behind the rooftops, she looked once more at the silent cottage. Someone had vanished. Yet what disturbed her most wasn't the disappearance itself. It was the unsettling feeling that somebody had worked very hard to make sure no one ever asked why. Chapter 2. The Silence That Didn't Belong. The following morning, Inspector Harris arrived at Mrs. Hargreaves' cottage with the steady confidence of a man who expected the facts to arrange themselves neatly. He unlocked the front door and stood for a moment before stepping inside. The house was silent. Not the peaceful silence of an empty home, but the uneasy sort that seemed to have settled there for a very long time. Miss Marple entered behind him, her eyes moving slowly across every corner. A kettle still rested on the stove. A cardigan hung neatly over the back of a chair. Beside the fireplace sat a basket containing gray wool, 2 knitting needles, and half a finished scarf. It looked as though Mrs. Hargreaves had simply stepped into the garden and never returned. Inspector Harris searched each room carefully. Cupboards were full. The wardrobe still held every dress. Her walking shoes stood beside the back door, polished and ready. On the kitchen table rested a small notebook containing a shopping list written in neat handwriting. Bread, butter, tea, jam. Nothing unusual. Nothing that suggested a woman planning to leave her home forever. "There isn't a single sign of trouble," the inspector said, closing another drawer. "No broken lock, no missing money, no struggle." Miss Marple gently picked up the spectacles resting beside the open book in the sitting room. A fine layer of dust covered the lenses. "Perhaps," she replied quietly, "the trouble happened somewhere else." The inspector looked puzzled. "You believe she left this house willingly?" "I believe," said Miss Marple, placing the spectacles back exactly where she had found them, "that people carry certain habits with them wherever they go. Mrs. Hargreaves was careful, orderly. She wouldn't leave without her glasses. She certainly wouldn't leave her knitting unfinished." Inspector Harris gave a polite smile. He respected Miss Marple, though he rarely understood how she reached her conclusions. After leaving the cottage, Miss Marple wandered through the village alone. The morning market was busy. The butcher greeted his customers with cheerful jokes. The postman cycled past, whistling as though the world held no mysteries at all. Everything appeared wonderfully ordinary. Yet every time she casually mentioned Mrs. Hargreaves' name, people reacted in the same curious way. They frowned, they paused, then they quickly spoke about something else. It wasn't that they refused to remember her. It was almost as though remembering had become uncomfortable. Near the church, Miss Marple stopped beside the old graveyard where Mrs. Hargreaves had spent nearly every Sunday tending her parents' resting place. Fresh white daisies had been placed against the weathered stone. They looked no more than a day old. She bent down for a closer look. The flowers were arranged neatly enough, but something was missing. Mrs. Hargreaves had always tied a narrow piece of blue ribbon around the stems. Everyone in the village knew it. This small bunch carried no ribbon at all. Someone had copied the habit, but they hadn't copied it properly. As Miss Marple stood, she noticed the village solicitor walking through the church gate. He tipped his hat politely and asked whether she was settling into Ashcombe. His manner was warm, friendly, yet when his eyes drifted towards the daisies, something changed. The smile weakened, his shoulders stiffened, only for a second. Then the pleasant expression returned. Most people would have overlooked it. Miss Marple never overlooked the smallest change in a person's face. That evening the Crown Inn filled with villagers escaping the autumn chill. The fire burned brightly, glasses clinked together, laughter echoed against the old wooden beams. The solicitor became the center of attention, telling amusing stories that had everyone smiling. Yet each time Mrs. Hargreaves' name appeared in conversation, however briefly, he reached for his glass before speaking. Sometimes he laughed too quickly. Sometimes he changed the subject altogether. Inspector Harris sat nearby, listening to a farmer complain about missing sheep. He noticed none of it. Miss Marple noticed everything. She had spent her life watching people.
They often revealed more in ordinary moments than during serious questioning. A trembling hand, a forced smile, a joke told at exactly the wrong time. Those tiny things spoke far louder than words ever could. As she walked home beneath the evening mist, the village seemed peaceful once again. Lights glowed warmly behind cottage windows. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called across the fields. Ashcombe looked exactly as it always had. But beneath that quiet little village, someone was making certain that Edith Hargreaves stayed forgotten. And that, Miss Marple knew, was not an accident. It was part of the plan.
Chapter 3. The Woman They Tried to Erase. The next afternoon, Miss Marple asked Inspector Harris to gather a small group inside the village hall. The vicar came. The doctor arrived looking puzzled. The baker, the postmaster, and the village solicitor all took their seats without quite knowing why. Outside, rain tapped gently against the old windows. Inside, nobody spoke. Miss Marple stood quietly beside the fireplace, her knitting resting untouched in her lap. "I believe," she said, "that Mrs. Edith Hargreaves didn't leave this village. I believe she died here, and I believe someone worked very hard to make sure nobody thought to look for her." A murmur spread around the room. Inspector Harris folded his arms. "What makes you so certain?" "Because every trace of her life was left exactly where it belonged. Her clothes, her spectacles, her knitting, her shopping list. Whoever wanted her gone understood that removing those things would raise questions. Leaving them behind created a different story, one where everyone simply assumed she'd gone away." She turned towards the solicitor. "You also made sure her house was swept. Flowers continued to appear at her parents' grave, just enough to suggest that someone was still quietly living there. But the flowers lacked the blue ribbon Mrs. Hargreaves always tied around them. Only someone copying her habits would forget such a small detail." The room fell silent. The solicitor's calm expression slowly disappeared. Miss Marple continued in the same gentle voice. "Mrs. Hargreaves discovered an old bundle of property papers. They proved that several acres of farmland had never legally belonged to the person who sold them years ago. Someone had altered the records. Someone stood to lose everything if the truth came out." Inspector Harris looked sharply at the solicitor. "The land?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "The solicitor handled every document. Mrs. Hargreaves confronted him. She believed he would correct the mistake. Instead, he silenced the only person who knew the truth." For several long seconds nobody moved. Then the solicitor let out a slow breath and lowered his head. "I never meant," he whispered. "She wouldn't stop asking questions." Inspector Harris stepped forward as two constables entered the hall. Without a struggle, the solicitor held out his hands. The room remained completely still as he was quietly led away. No dramatic protest, no desperate excuse, only the sound of the rain outside. A week later, the truth spread through Ashcombe. Villagers spoke of Mrs. Hargreaves with deep regret. They couldn't understand how they had stopped thinking about her. Miss Marple believed the answer was simple. People often accepted the easiest explanation because it demanded nothing of them. It was comfortable, and comfort can be surprisingly dangerous. As the evening sun settled over the village, Miss Marple paused outside the little stone cottage one last time. The windows stood open. Fresh roses had been planted beside the gate. Life had begun to return. She smiled gently and adjusted her knitting bag. People disappear, but the truth rarely stays hidden forever.
If you enjoyed solving this mystery with Miss Marple, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your own thoughts in the comments. Somewhere in another quiet English village, someone is already keeping the next secret, and Miss Marple has a habit of finding them.